Welcome back, you guys. This is the Art School Graduate. I'm your host today, Justin Robinson, and the guest I have today, let me tell you, I am joined by two brilliant minds behind, I said it correctly, Foossa. Their work blends storytelling, strategy, and participatory design to tackle real-world challenges in communities around the globe. My guest today is Lee Sean and David. How are you both doing today, fellas?
Doing great. Thanks for having us, Justin.
No
Yeah,
problem.
I'm looking forward to a chance to talk about some of this work because it's invigorating too to be reminded with the retrospective view of like, oh yeah, this is cool. We did that, you know. So thank you for reaching out.
No problem. So we were talking a little bit before we started recording. Did I say the name right? Is it Foossa? Could you guys break that down for us?
And actually, Lushan, do you want to tell some of the story of how we alighted on the correctly pronounced Fusa?
Indeed, yeah. So Foossa we're named after an animal from Madagascar. It's sort of like a weasel cat looking animal. If folks who have kids or know about the Madagascar cartoon series will be aware of this, but in the language of Madagascar, it's spelled with only one O, so it's Fossa. But when it came time for us to name our design practice, I used to live in Japan and I'm Taiwanese originally. And so we just have like mascots for everything. So it's like, what is our Hello Kitty or our Mickey Mouse or Joe the Camel kind of animal? And we just started looking through the different animals, but so many of them were like animals that we liked were taken, like
Mhm.
red pandas and raccoons and stuff like that. So it was like, what was like a short enough animal name that, people could pronounce, and also was like kind of quote unquote ownable. And so we just went alphabetically, came across Fusa. It looked cool. Folks can Google it and see what it looks like. And then we just changed the spelling to make it kind of a ownable name where we could get the URL and make it a little bit more pronounceable for folks. But
Yeah.
yeah, we still cause problems because people don't get the two O's, two S's thing. And so it's what not to do in branding 101, but we had to learn that the hard way.
Okay. All right. So let's start from the beginning. What sparked the idea for Fusa? Was there like a specific moment that you both shared? Was there a frustration that led for you guys to create this whole thing that's rooted in community and participation? Like, was there a singular moment or was it just both of you ran into this frustration in the creative marketplace?
I think there are different frustrations as well as some economic needs there. David, do you want to start
Yeah,
or
sure.
do you want to take this
I
on?
think, I guess, to back up for a sec, maybe like some of the thesis behind Fusa and how we were thinking about this was like we wanted to change like the kind of level of analysis and intervention for some of the problems that we were interested in working on. And what do I mean by that? I mean, like we're all familiar with human-centered design. We all like IDEO and the D school and so on. That always struck me as limiting in some respects, right? Like I think the human-centered design outlook can yield really helpful designs for consumer software or other kinds of products or like some of the service design we focus, like I think it all works there. But when you're thinking about social issues and social problems, complex systems that you want to intervene in and so on, the human-centered design framing is kind of like atomistic, right? It's like we're going to look at this from the perspective of an individual user, like understand their needs and design with empathy and all the rest, right? Like, but what we were trying to formulate here is a focus on, well, how do like networks or communities of people interact? Can we understand a phenomenon better by looking at like a community or a network? And so we started throwing around this term that I think we've, has kind of guided a lot of our practice, community-centered design instead, right? So a focus on like a different level of analysis. And I guess maybe if I'm not going over here with this, like maybe it's helpful just to give like an analogy, right? Like you're in LA. Think about traffic. You understand a traffic jam differently depending on how you're situated. If you are in your car and you're experiencing a traffic jam, you experience it as a series of stopping and starting. And as a kid, I remember like in my car seat asking my mom, like, "Hey, why don't the people in front just drive faster?" you know, and and you kind of need to assume a different vantage point in order to understand what's happening in a traffic jam, right? Like, oh, well, if you're in a traffic helicopter looking down, you see that it's like a backward propagating wave, around like connections between different highways or at exit entrance ramps and so on, right? And you see that there's a compression wave moving backward against the flow of traffic, right? Like the different perspective on the situation allows you to name the situation differently and has you thinking differently about interventions in it. And that was some of the thinking with the community centered design frame.
So I'm curious now with your tagline, design for participation, what does that mean to like each of you? Like how does that hold space for each of you?
Well, I mean, I think participation is one of those really capacious kind of terms, right? But about like perspective. It's the idea that diversity gives you a diversity of perspectives, right? Diversity of stakeholders. And, like that works in demographic diversity, but it works
Mhm.
in like functional diversity too. Like we did a series of projects with the city of New York, for example, right? And, redesigning some public services, primarily targeting low and moderate income New Yorkers. And, like for a typical like program design, you start out with like, oh, hey, I'm a policy analyst or a policy person, and I want to work on this program providing financial coaching, and debt management for folks, or and linking them up with resources and so on. And you can design a program that way.
Mhm.
And there's like that follows kind of like a top-down model of doing it, right? But then there are, more participatory approaches, understanding, what like the users of the program's needs are, how they're coming to use the service, how they're learning about it. How do you incorporate feedback and learning in a system like that? You need to be able to create the structures where, hey, you're a parent, on Snap and Wick, and like you're working with your family, and maybe there are other commitments and so on. So like, how do you, as that person who's situated, come to like feed into the design of a program that is being cooked up by policy analysts, elected officials, and whomever, right?
Yeah.
How do you sit at the same table and have like language that enables participation from all parties, from
Mhm.
nonprofits who are doing the implementation,
Mhm.
like city staffers who are like doing the performance metrics or something, users
Gotcha.
of the service.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
how do you design interactions to enable meaningful participation
Mhm.
in like the scoping and the work of that kind of service? And so like that's one of the like the North Stars that we have. It's like, okay, we need to just like start from that premise that like we want broad-based participation in the work that we're doing. And so a lot of it is designing interactions and fora so that participation can be meaningful and not just an exercise in kind of like box checking or something that is like a more performative
Gotcha.
participation theater, maybe. And so
Gotcha.
it's hard. I don't know if we get it right all the time either, but Lucian, do you want to add to that? Sorry, I don't need to go over.
Yeah, I can pick up the torch from that one. I think it's worth noting for our listeners here. I have a political science degree from undergrad, and David studied public policy, public administration for his first master's program. And so that's the lens that we look at design through. I'd
Okay.
always been a creative person as well, and we can dig into our backgrounds. But for me, I see design, participatory design, community centered design as filling in this middle space. We live in a
Mhm.
democratic society aspirationally, in this sense, and that it fills in this gap between like being a citizen and going to vote every 2 years or 4 years, depending on which
Gotcha.
elections you vote in, and then these sort of limited consumer choices, right? Are you going to
Mhm.
buy the the big, the big
The blue
conglomerate,
widget?
or are you going to
Yeah.
buy the like organic shampoo that's made fair trade locally,
Mhm.
whatever, right? And like, so there's these consumer choices, there's these political choices, even within a two-party system. And then
Mhm.
we look at design through the lens of power. And
Mhm.
so basically, we're to kind of riff on RuPaul's idea of like we're all born naked and the rest is drag. We're all born naked and the rest is design, right? Like the
Mm.
whole world that we live in has been designed through various people's design choices, both
Yeah.
from like the road that is outside of our house right now to the house that we're in to the software that we're using right now, and all of that mediates our relationships to each other. And so by bringing participation into that, I think it's about an extension of democracy or bringing power into that, right? So it's not
Yeah.
just the people who are the VCs funding tech startups or who are benefiting from something, or a consumer benefiting
Mhm.
from something, but like the communities affected by design choices having some sort of say or input into these processes, I think is the aspirational ethos behind what we do.
So, Lee, you said something, and I wrote it down. So, whenever you guys see me look down, that means I'm writing, right? I'm not on my phone or anything. But you said something that kind of stuck with me. We are all born naked. Then the rest is design.
Mhm.
What? How does that come to fruition in this type of, I want to say, creative co-op that you guys have? Because I know your background is rooted in storytelling and civic. David, you bring the systems and the thinking and the strategy. So taking that little phrase right there, we are all born naked and the rest is design. How does that fit in for each one of you?
Yeah. I can start, I guess, since I brought this up. So, the way that I see it is that this comes up a lot for us as educators, and we also do a lot of facilitation
Mhm,
with different community members, with stakeholders within corporations who don't necessarily self-identify as like quote unquote creatives, right? And I
mhm,
really dislike this distinction between who's a creative and who's not. So part of our goal is just to say like everyone is creative in this sense, but in terms of like being born naked, right? I mean, it's like this is what sets us apart from other
mhm,
animals in that we, as humans, shape our environments, or we make clothing, or we choose clothing
mhm,
and live in homes, in that sense. And I think part of this sense of power and creative empowerment, part for people to realize that they can also be creatives, they're also designers, is to recognize that most of the systems that we're born into and live under are the products of, say, historical forces, right? Of
mhm.
design and
Got you.
just, we live in this old city, Providence. The the street in front of our house that our house is on is just too narrow because it was built for horse carts, right?
Right.
It's not for 2 lanes of traffic and parking and street parking. So there's all of these things there, but it's not a force of nature, right? Like nature did
Mm,
not make this road too narrow. It's really because of these historical factors and some design choice in the past, right? That we still have
mhm,
to live with today. And so part of that is also just denaturalizing some of these things and saying like
mhm.
because something is designed, it can be redesigned.
Got you.
It can be hard to do that with the political will and the funding and whatnot, but like the world that we live in is this
Mhm.
product of design that we can redesign, I think is one of the main points.
Got you. Got you. David, what do you think about that?
To pick up on your last point, Lishan, like I think so one of the hats that I wear these days is like I'm working on finishing a PhD, and like an interesting detour. This is actually becoming more central to some of the stuff that I'm writing about. But like, was looking at the design of institutions post World War II. Like,
Mhm,
okay, Europe is in ruins. How do we rethink a global system and a global order and avoid the factors that led to World War II, including
mhm,
like hyperinflation, nationalism, and all the rest, right? Like, and reading about the negotiations and meetings while the war is still being fought about like what like the international system ought to look like after this, like
mhm,
is it, like it's illuminating to your point, Lejon. Like these things are not inevitable; they're not forces of nature.
mhm,
So like yeah, what's his name, Harry Dexter White, and John Maynard Keynes, and like all the negotiations that are going on at Bretton Woods for like, oh well, what do our international economic institutions look
mhm,
like? What does reconstruction financing look like? What do we want the state to build? Like,
And what
um,
is money, right? I mean, there's
James actually
dimensions.
wrote a treatise on money, and it was just like money itself is an interesting social technology, right?
mhm,
And so like this piece of paper or scrap of gold has no inherent value. We ascribe value to it, right? And
mhm,
we build systems around that. And so but just as a small example, Britain is on the verge of bankruptcy at the end of the war, right? Like and hawk to American creditors, like the London's been
mhm.
bombed. The industrial base has been tooled around wartime
Yeah.
production. And, at this time, like there was a reimagining of what the state could offer, right? You see the National Health Service rolled out. You see, like arts councils in every neighbor. It's like, oh, well, that seems like an odd thing to focus on when you're rebuilding from war. Like the idea that Keynes and his wife in particular were very, central in advancing was that like, well, what's it all for? What are we doing here? And it's like, well, we just fought this war. We want to live in a world and in a country where there is more space for arts and culture, and like everyone has the capacity to be a creative producer, to your earlier point, right? And how do we cultivate?
So I'm just curious now, how did your guys' path cross? Because it seems like you guys are very much not polar opposites, but like you guys work in different realms. Like I could, it's like you could even tell by like visually what I'm looking at is like, I'm looking at David. He's very just like, you can see that he's like thinking, he's analyzing, he's in his zone. And then I look at Lee Sean, and Lee Sean looks like, man, I'm just happy the sun's out today. So it's just like, how do you guys have this? How did your paths cross? Like, I'm so curious. And then it was just like, you can even tell from the answers you guys give. I'm just like, okay, I'm curious to know how these paths cross to like it almost like it crossed and it complements each other very well. So can you guys, whoever would like to take this one, break that down for it?
Yeah, perhaps you could kick us off on that origin story.
Sure. So we were dating before we started Foossa together, and we met on OkCupid, which dates us as well in terms of
This is
the time
2010,
period.
folks.
2010. I think, well, David messaged me first. He basically asked me if I was a unicorn, which I thought was really cute. And we had chatted on and off for a while. But this is really funny. Like it was like we really enjoyed chatting with each other online. I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to meet with him in person because like this is in New York City where we both lived for many years and where we met. And his photos just weren't great. And, with online dating experiences, most people look better in their photos than in real life. And I think I didn't realize he just had the confidence of like some like badly lit, like candid photos. There's one of him playing video game, like an arcade game or pinball or something. And I was like, who is this guy? He seems really nice, really smart. And then finally we went on a date because he was like, oh, I'm moving to Kenya after I graduate from NYU, and it's like, okay, this is really like low stakes. And then like that went well, and it kind of went from there in terms of our romantic relationship. But just like fast forward a little bit to the first part, I had been working at a creative agency in New York called Purpose. I had started there, I think I was like the 6th or 7th employee when it was 2 IKEA tables in a loft space in a village. And like that's really where I learned the agency business and consulting in New York. I had started working there as an intern when I was in grad school at NYU and worked there for a while. And I got to do a lot of cool projects. And, I went to India. I got to live in Brazil for a few months. So it was a great learning experience. But by the time I was ready to leave, they had grown into like 50 odd people. And like it's just a different vibe. And I was looking for more immediate hands-on creative control rather than like middle management kind of stuff. So I was like looking around. David can fill in the stuff on his side, but he was working in consulting in Boston and got laid off. And then a Hurricane Sandy happened and
my goodness.
I lost power in my apartment. At first they thought like I couldn't move back in for a year. Luckily that turned into like a month. And then they hooked up a generator and stuff like that. But like sitting in the dark, we started plotting, starting a new business because it's like, you never know what life is going to give you. So might as well start in that case. But I don't know, David, do you want to fill in some of the gaps to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, a phrase that kind of rattles around in my head often. I came from a 7th grade social studies teacher of mine, but necessity is the mother of invention, right? And I think that probably applies to me a little bit more directly, because as Lishan was saying, like, I had lost my job and I had been going through a fairly tortured and long interview process with like a big consulting company in New York. And after 6 months of interviews, they're like, okay, well, we're ready to extend an offer and blah, blah, blah. But then that got extended because the team was working on their chargeability and so on. Now, I think you, Lishan, you encouraged me a whole lot, with this like, oh, well, actually, be doing this on your own. And so we ended up like hanging up a shingle, you know,
Out of
on it
WeWork,
out of some of these
essentially.
conversations, like, oh, well, rather than wait for this company to finally
Mhm.
get back to you about your start date and to like offer
Mhm.
package, like, let's do this ourselves. And so, yeah, I think like, Lishan, you were planning some of your exit. And I think you spoke to this a moment ago that like, it's difficult when your company or your team is growing and you go from like this individual contributor role and
Mhm.
then it's like, okay, well, what do you do? Like, what's the advancement
Mhm.
trajectory? Do you manage people who are designers or, like, but if you want to keep doing more of the like individual contributor kind of work, how do you
Yeah.
do that while
Mhm.
advancing? So I think you were hitting some friction there. And I was like, oh, well, I guess I need to figure out what else I'm doing here. And, my head filled with thoughts of, possibility, I think
Yeah.
like made me more amenable to just like taking the plunge. And so
Mm.
that we formed an LLC, opened a bank account with, like
I think it
I,
was like
I
20
guess
bucks each or
yeah, I
something.
know. Like we were like, okay, like I was because I you called me from the bank and I was at the gym. And you're like, oh hey, let's open this account here and now. And I was like, okay. And so we just within the annals of Foossa lore, we started out with like it was like yeah, I think it was $40 in our checking account because we were like, okay, here we go.
Man, that's incredible. So, how is it working with your partner? Like, how do you keep it business, professional, like all these different avenues that most people have to like not juggle with. It's like when people leave work, they close that door and work is over. But it's like how do you guys balance that dynamic to just still be keep it healthy for you guys?
I mean, I would say that there's not a solution so much as resolving the problem multiple times, under different circumstances with whatever's going on and so on. I
Mm,
think, yeah, like I personally, I guess I've always had jobs that were fairly like consuming, and I mentioned earlier I'm doing a PhD now too, and so it's like, oh well, that's another one of those jobs that you never are finished with, like
yeah.
small business stuff. You're never really finished, so things bleed over from one zone to another frequently. And, like we were also teaching together at Parsons for a couple of years as well. And like we went for like a period of like very intense separation and long distance. Like Lishan mentioned, I had moved to Nairobi for a bit and he had moved to Rio. And then I was in Boston and he was in New York. And so we went from like long distance relationship to, oh, let's start a business together and spend
Mhm.
all of our waking hours together as well, and then teach on the side together.
Yeah. We did start the business before moving in with each other. I think that was part of the separation
Okay.
initially to have like some sort of buffer, but then eventually we did that. And then, yeah, as David said, like he
Mhm.
started this PhD in 2018. So
Mhm.
moved back up to Boston. The pandemic brought us back together. During that time, I also started working at AIGA. So that's
Mhm.
my primary thing right now. I am co-executive director of programming at AIGA, which is the Professional Association for Design. So I'm in charge of all of our events and content and stuff
Mhm.
like that. So
That's
Afusa went from being like our main thing where we had like employees and office space to more of like a side hustle, private kind of commissions and stuff
mhm.
like that. So it's still a vehicle of collaboration, but I think it's evolved over the years for different things. And then who knows, when David finishes the PhD, maybe that's our full time thing again. So we'll see.
Got you. Okay.
But,
Okay.
to try to answer your question more directly, right? Like sometimes it's like, okay, Lishan's making dinner and I'm doing bookkeeping. And then it's like,
Mhm.
okay, the night shift where we're working on proposals, after that.
Got
And
you.
it can be really intense and difficult. And I
Mm.
don't mean to minimize either the intensity or difficulty of that sometimes. But, I think like I think having a separate office that wasn't at home helped
Mhm.
too, because I think just even like the transit, it was like a 15-20 minute walk or something, but just that, like the walk in between home and work, offers a little bit of
Yeah.
buffer. And like, I think that there are these, things that sound small like that, you accumulate enough of them. I think it gives a little bit of breathing room for us to exist in different zones, you
Got
know?
you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I was just curious, man, because it's just like some people I know. Whoo, business and partnerships sometimes don't work, but it seems like you guys have a healthy balance of it. So I want to commend you both on that because I got some friends that'll tell you something different.
Well, I mean, it's tough
Okay.
when you want to complain about your coworker.
To your coworker, like, man, this guy, can you believe him? I'm standing right here. I know. It's just like,
Actually, we should have done that more. Let's just have like vent about work.
oh man. Okay, so I'm sorry, I got off track, but I was just curious. I think that's beautiful that you guys are making this work for each other. So let's talk about your studio. So your studio blends a lot of storytelling, service design, systems thinking. So let's dig into like how do you make that work? Like when you're faced with like a complex challenge, how do you decide like where to begin, which method usually needs to be first? Like, how do you guys break that up?
I mean, I think the headline for this answer, I guess, is that we see story and strategy as intertwined, right? And so when we're thinking about designing an experience or a service or product or whatever, there's always like the story, and not just like, how do you pitch this to investors or how do you pitch this to potential customers of a product or service or whatnot. It's also like, what is the why
Gotcha.
in that sense, right? What are the motivations, like, and also the story of like, how is the world different when your thing is in it, right? Like, what? Let's just like use widget as the placeholder thing. If it's with your widget in the world, like, how do people's lives change? How do your users' lives change? But how do your investors' lives change, right? So there's that as a possibility story, and then like there's obviously the strategies of how you tell that story to different audiences and stuff like that. So that's kind of how we think at that macro level. But in terms of like specific projects, we had the chance starting about a decade ago, but this lasted a couple years of multiple parts of this project. We got to work with the Kigali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda, which is very intense emotional experience. It's also the site of a mass grave of a 250,000 people who were killed in this genocide. And so there's a lot of responsibility to working on a project like that. A lot of the people who work there actually are survivors of the genocide themselves. And it also needs to serve multiple audiences, like school kids across Rwanda go there to visit, to learn about their own history. People whose relatives were killed in the genocide go there because it's it's their final resting place of their loved ones. But also international visitors, heads of state go there, like Bono went there shortly before we started going there for our project. And so for something like that, there's the story of like, this is what happened over the 100 days of this genocide in 94, I believe, in the 90s. And then there's also like the strategic way you tell this story of like, when we first visited, you essentially go through the exhibit. It's chronological from the colonial times under the Germans and the Belgians to independence and what happened to this children's room, which is really just like this heart-wrenching thing about like profiling some of the kids who were killed in this genocide and what their favorite foods and stuff were. And so stuff like that, where it's like, okay, you're responsible for truth telling, but also like, what do you do when you like emotionally destroy visitors, with something like that? Like it just seems like you can't just say like, donate here or exit through the gift shop, right? It just like, tonally, it's a difficult thing. So one of the insights from that first trip was just like, how do you sequence this storytelling? So it's like, okay, you don't want to shy away from the truth and just like the emotional impact of this, but there were stories that were almost sort of buried in the middle that could be highlighted more. There was like a story of now a woman, but a girl at the time who essentially like adopted a baby from the arms of the baby's mother who was dying, bleeding out, and like even as an 11-year-old girl, like raised this baby as her own daughter, right? Or there was another woman who was like sort of a medicine woman type person who had a reputation of being a witch, but that allowed her to save people because she could put them up in her barn, and she like, because there was a threat of like she could curse the people, she was able to keep the genocide squads away. So there are stories like that were already part of the exhibition, but it's like, how do you highlight heroes or like resequence this experience so people kind of know what they're getting into, but also see that there were people who were trying to save as many people as they could, right? So things like that are very much tied into like how we think about story.
Partnering with an organization called UX for Good, which recruits designers to, as the name kind of implies, do projects that are like that have a social mission, and like how do you bring together a team of designers who are all working in different fields or get their own practices or what have you, and assemble a team and go and undertake something that we wouldn't have done on our own, or at least initially, right? And so Lishan, do you want to talk about the Inzovu curve there? Because I think that that's some narrative storytelling and storytelling strategy, excuse me, narrative strategy that's useful to answer this point too.
Yeah. So one of the design outputs from the early phase is called the Inzovu curve. Inzovu means elephant in Kinyarwanda, the national language of Rwanda. And basically it looks like, I don't know if we're recording this video, but looks like the trunk of an elephant, like raised like this.
Mhm.
And basically the idea here is that with telling the story of a genocide, like there's people have like an emotional limit before they just start to shut down, right? Part of the kind of upside of the curve is like, how do you tell these stories of hope? How do you tell stories of heroism, so that you can also inspire people, and then also like strategically sequence stuff like that at the end, but also prime people at the beginning of the story. Hey, this is not like a trigger warning in this way necessarily, because people know that they're going to a genocide memorial, right? But it's more just like, okay, how do you prime people emotionally for that? So with this curve, like over the course of the project, based on this insight, the museum was able to get a commission of a short documentary that visitors today get to watch that documentary before going into the main exhibit. And that documentary features genocide survivors, like in the present moment of when that documentary was made, which was like almost 20 years after the genocide, as a way of saying like, okay, life continues for these survivors. They're falling in love and living their lives and stuff like that. And then you go back to that, because that was another insight, was that there was a disconnect between like what happened in the 90s and then Rwanda today, right? So then how do you like connect these historical moments to like, why is Rwanda like it is today? Because of this traumatic history, but also people are trying to rebuild their lives and live their lives that way. So that was just one example of how these dots get connected.
And actually, just to like add a little bit of a gloss to that too, the experience of visiting the memorial, as Leishon was just saying, like visitors come in and see this kind of this documentary where you're learning about and following the stories of three survivors of the genocide and what they had gone through, what they did to survive, what their lives were like, right? And you get a sense of the losses that they incurred, right? And so you're going to a genocide memorial, you understand that you're not going for uplift necessarily, right? But after going through the museum and walking through the exhibits and the reflection garden and the memorial, there's a room where you can watch like another, as LaShawn was saying, the second part of that documentary, where these same three people are now shown like living their lives, so they're married, they have children and so on. And that's sort of the narrative arc of the Inzovu curve too, right? That you can't avoid or skate past the, like, maybe we could call it a kind of like empathetic exhaustion, of that traumatic experience, but you don't want like emotional burnout or shutting down to be like the end point there, and so it's like, how do you tell a story of like life going on, like look to the people who are continuing to live their lives, and I think that concretizes some of the experiences, not just the abstract thing. And so at any rate, I think that to your question about narrative strategy, it's like, okay, well, how do we showcase real harms and real suffering? And not to say that everything is hunky-dory at the end, but to look to people who are living and follow their example, really, of like what it means to go on living. And I think that in miniature, that documentary kind of reflects some of the emotional journey of going through the memorial and creating like a sort of like narrative coherence to the experience that allows you to then take action as a visitor, either by learning more about the genocide, by working on genocide prevention. And so there are opportunities to then engage, kind of following and inspired by those examples.
Yes. So how do you guys find the balance between like these different approaches that might be pulling you in different directions. It's like, have you ever encountered like a tension between like storytelling versus like a system that needs to be implemented? So how do you guys deal with that different balances and different approaches? Because I feel like some projects call for storytelling, but some also require probably a higher system that
Mm.
that might not inquire or require storytelling. So how do you guys find that balance to make it flow smoothly?
Yeah. There's another visual that I encourage listeners to look up. This is from the Bush era 2010, or I guess.
It's Obama, but
Oh, that's Obama, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. This is Obama level, but Obama era.
Mhm.
But there was a New York Times piece about this PowerPoint slide about like the war in Afghanistan that is just like the systems map of that's like, it looks like
Mhm.
spaghetti and like these different labels and stuff like that. And it's like kind of almost like a parody of PowerPoint, but
Mhm.
is real in that sense. And so I think that's often what we think of in terms of a complex system, right? Because
Mhm.
it is complex and mapping it out does have a value.
Mhm.
But then just zooming out and looking at it, you're like, what the heck is this? Right. And so this is how like stories help us make sense of that. Like, a lot of our work has also involved like coaching and facilitating, say, folks who are technical experts in something, whether it was like a founder of a fintech startup or somebody who knows a lot about something in finance or diplomacy or something like that, right?
Mhm.
Where it's like, okay, all of their expertise and all of this is important, but then it's like, okay, how do you talk about this to a normal person? How do you
Yeah.
talk about this to a potential customer of your
Yeah. Yeah.
fintech app or whatever without having to do all of that? And so a lot of that is like translation. Some of it has to do with like, okay, how do you focus on the origin story of why the founder decided to
Mhm.
create this thing? Or like, how do you tell the story that's more of a user journey of like, okay, if I download this app for whatever, how do I use it? And that's the story. And then there's for the folks who are technically inclined or are curious, like, yes, you can like dig under the surface to understand this complex system. But then I think the final point before I pass the torch potentially is thinking about, we just recently watched Andor, Star Wars Andor, which really looks at like more at that like human level, like what does the bureaucracy of a totalitarian empire look like, right? and
Mhm.
and so that is a complex system, but by looking at it through like these point of view characters and like specific incidents, for example, we're able to like grok the whole, rather than like that PowerPoint slide of like what the management structure of the empire might look like, but it creates this emotional understanding. I think that is
Okay.
important.
Okay. Yeah. I
maybe
like
just
that.
to add to that a little bit, like I would say that, like when you're thinking about defining a system or where you draw system boundaries or boundaries within systems to separate different elements or what have you, like that's partly or maybe even centrally a storytelling decision, right? In some of the literature on complex adaptive systems or socio-technical system design or something, you see like this question of where to draw the boundary to say like, okay, this is the thing that these are the level of interactions that we're looking at, and we're going to put some of these other interactions in like a
Mhm.
black box that we just need to know the outputs of or something rather
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
how it all works, right? I don't know, right? These are two analogies, maybe one will be good, but think of a car and an internal combustion engine car, right? Like you can look at the car as a system of different parts working together. So you might have a box that represents the engine and a box that represents the transmission and a box that represents, climate control or whatever it is, right?
Mhm.
And you can see the relationships between these different elements.
Mhm.
But if you are trying to diagnose a problem with the engine, well, you have to look and see like, oh, are the pistons firing or what have you? And you need to like open that black box, right? So depending on your need I think this like is a proxy for the storytelling here. Depending on the kind of story that you want to tell, like that guides your focus, right?
Mhm.
So need and story combine to help you draw these system boundaries, and
Mhm.
you can like think of systems as like nested complexity, right? So like there's the complexity of the chemical process of like igniting gasoline, creating explosions that fire
Yeah.
pistons,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's the complexity of the engine itself. There's the complexity of the whole car working. There's the complexity of cars in traffic, to go back to the earlier example, right? So the level of analysis partly determined by how you define need, like where you want to focus your attention. And that's a story thing, like that is a storytelling thing. Like, we can look at widespread, drug use and addiction as like a story of individual, decision making, but we could also look at it as of medical practice and the prescriptions of opioids, right? Or we can look at it at the level of like, oh, well, we don't do a lot of preventative medicine in the US, at a societal level. And so consequently, we're treating symptoms of repetitive strain injuries or something with opioids. And so,
Totally.
like where you draw that boundary is a storytelling decision. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you guys for fleshing that out, because it just seems like it's not a two-headed monster, but it's more of a two-headed, like, brilliant design that you guys are trying to pull from. So that's why I was curious with that question, because it's just like I can see the strategy and the thinking, but it's also the storytelling, which is huge in a lot of you guys' like design stuff that you've worked with. Like, you've worked with public institutions, nonprofits, you've told these wonderful stories for like grassroots communities. So I was just wondering, like, how does that balance? And I'm also curious with challenges. Like, how have you guys dealt with some of these challenges when you're like co-designing with these communities? Like, how do you navigate these like very tricky and sometimes delicate moments?
I don't have a complete answer to that, but I think part of it is acknowledging that, well, here, just when you're a designer or a consultant or someone brought in to work on a project, there's a defined problem. And in our experience, it's like, oh, well, the folks who hire us have already hired Bain, McKinsey, BCG, or whomever, or they've already done, certain types of analysis on a problem, have defined it in a certain way. And, they're then looking to like, is that the best we can do? Can we do this differently? Are we solving the underlying issue? And then it's like, oh, well, maybe we need to re-examine how we're defining and framing this problem. And, like that, I think is like a central part of like a good design practice. It's like, examining the way a problem is presented to you and as it's structured, right? Because all the stuff that goes into framing and defining a problem, reflects some of the power dynamics that Lishan was mentioning earlier, right? Like, who gets to say what the problem is, and who gets to determine when like you're bringing in outside help on something, right? Like, so understanding the processes that have led to like where we come in, is an important part of that work. And I think that it's not easy to do. I mean, like, you're hired by a primary stakeholder, and that's the person who's paying you, and they have to sign off on the deliverables. And so, and they have their, like the project sponsor within the organization that hired you, has to have, like, they've got their own needs politically and managerially within their organization, right? So there's navigating all of that. And I think that just understanding the positional nature of knowledge. It's like your perspective on a problem as like a user of a public service for low-income New Yorkers is going to be different from the program commissioner who's answering to the mayor, who's answering to the voters, versus the program officer who, so in like understanding that different stakeholders will have a different sense of what the problem is, but they will have different senses of what the indicators for progress or non-progress look like. All of that is challenging, but bearing in mind the nature of that challenge, I think makes you more sensitive to seeing where a different framing or a different possibility might be situated. That was a little convoluted. I'm not sure. Is that?
If I may, like,
yeah, please untangle and condense that for me, Alicia.
Yeah. So for me, like, riffing off what DCR was talking about, like, for us as consultants, there's the business problem, which is like you often get hired to solve something that isn't the real problem or is the symptom, right? Like, this is pre-Foossa, but I do remember once when I was working in Brazil for Purpose, my previous agency, where we went to a meeting that was really about like branding and like narrative strategy. And like some guy asked us like, so how do you guarantee that the things that we post go viral, right? And that's like the wrong
Mm.
question, because it's like, oh, what do you want to say? Who are you trying to reach, right? Like we hadn't answered those things yet. So there's the sort of business model problem, and
Mhm.
trying to deal with the politics of expertise. And then related to that is just a more general issue about participation in general, which is that like humans are messy, right? And that
Yeah.
like communities of humans are often like messier. Like anybody who's watched an episode of Parks and Recreation has seen this.
Yes.
But we worked on a project with the UN that had to do with knowledge management for diplomats. And in one of the workshops that I was facilitating to just get creative ideas, it turned into a complaint session, because this is totally out of my realm of control, but it was happened that they were also doing like green building initiatives and taking away people's paper towels from the bathrooms and replacing them with the blow dryer things.
Yeah.
And it's just like, well, okay, like if y'all aren't even getting paper towels, it's really hard to talk about your file knowledge
Yeah.
management stuff, right? But that is like way above my pay grade, so it's like dealing with that. But often as the facilitator, as the design consultant, you are like seen as the face, right?
Mhm.
Because like going back again to that business problem, like management often hires you to be the face, to be the like handling whether it's the internal stakeholders or the customers, and you just have to absorb some of the stuff and
Mhm.
filter it out and say like, okay, well, this is not a solvable thing in my scope. But there is emotional labor
Yeah.
involved in that, right?
Yeah. So how do you guys, I would say, how do you define success with like, because it seems like you're touching on like ethical design, like social design within the work that you're doing. So how do you define success in those like spaces, especially when those outcomes aren't always like immediately visible? Because it's just like you guys said, like you just broke down that example of if you don't have paper towels, we can't get you to understand this. So it's just like, that you can set up a system or a design idea or a concept and go into these places, but you don't always get to see the immediate reaction to it. So how do you define like a project or a system is successful when you guys eventually like exit that space?
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Like I think one of the biggest indicators of success for us is thinking about cultural and organizational change with the stakeholders that we're working with.
Okay.
Like so
So success is the friends we've made along the way.
so something like that.
Yeah.
Right? Because like I'll go back to the New York City example, right? One of the projects that we were doing with the consumer affairs department was there were several projects around like services and New Yorkers' finances, right? But like one of the most exciting things to see in the course of that work, which we're doing with Parsons and the Desys lab at Parsons and various nonprofit partners who are implementing the program. So this is a big tent, right? But like seeing the folks in this government agency start thinking in terms of like, oh, well, what, like how do we do this differently? How do we define the problem? Are we asking, are we defining the problem correctly? How do we do like listening sessions, but also like activities that draw out, knowledge that's more latent, within the participants, as opposed to just like sending a survey or something, or putting everyone at a round table and saying, okay, now we've done our public engagement, like seeing people think differently about how they do their work and like foregrounding the importance of like a diversity of participants feeding into problem definition and into the co-design process. One of the biggest and most exciting things was like seeing this agency like take a real approach to prototyping, which is hard to do within the structure of the government contracts, right? Because you hire like implementing partners based on a scope of work that specifies, oh, you're going to do this for 5 years and these are the outcomes that we want to see. Like, how do you do prototyping in something like that? You have to get creative and you have to find people who are like internal champions of like a more iterative approach, right? And we saw that with this agency, right? And I think that pattern replicates across successful projects where we see like that kind of cultural institutional mindset change. And so I think there are other indicators of project success, but like that's a high level one that I think recurs across to a variety of projects.
I think there's like small indicators, especially in the consultant consulting agency business where it's like, okay, when your client like can pitch the work without you, or like
Mhm.
can start like speaking your
Recommended.
language without you, then
Yeah.
it's like, okay, you've like, there's some sort of like knowledge transmission there.
Mhm.
And then building on what David was saying with the New York City project, one of component of that was looking at client retention for financial counseling in New York. So basically,
Gotcha.
like people, New Yorkers would go talk to a financial counselor, and the data showed, it kind of makes sense, that the more appointments that you make and actually go to with your counselor, the more likely you are to meet your financial goal, whether it's like
Mhm.
balancing your budget or whatever that is. But what they found was that over the course of our scope of work, before any of the prototypes were even implemented, because
Mhm.
this takes time in city government, that retention was already going up. One of the hypotheses for this was that just by having designers there like shadowing counselors and like talking about the process
Mhm.
with counselors started to internalize like thinking about user experience as part of what they were doing, right? Because
Gotcha. Yeah.
these people are hardworking people, they know their finances and stuff like that, but their day-to-day work also means involved like checking boxes and making sure that they were collecting all the data that they needed to, for the city and stuff like that. And so just by introducing people who were like focused on user experience and like having that cultural like transmission to the counselors was already starting to affect the service, and people's clients' retention. So things like this
Mhm.
are really interesting to look at, but I think that knowledge and cultural transmission, and going back to a previous point I made about like getting people to start thinking about like user experience, and that they're also designers, they're also involved in the experience of these counseling clients, I think
Okay.
is really important.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you guys for breaking that down, because it's just, as a designer myself, I often get asked like, "How do you know it's successful?" I'm like,
Mhm.
I have no idea. And that's me being full transparent, like, because it's like people ask you for it, you work through it, you give it to them, you're happy at that moment, but it's kind of like on to the next. You know what I mean? And it kind of, you kind of don't have that moment to sit there and like breathe in the like, I just did this wonderful thing. You don't have that time, because it's like literally there's something else on your
Mhm.
desk. And then 9 times out of 10, you kind of are like, you think back to it sporadically, like as many creatives have. It's like you'll be sitting there reading, watching TV and be like, I wonder if that company's still doing, let me look them up. Like, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? So that's what I was just curious about for you guys when you're in a bigger space, on how you define that success. But thank you for sharing that. So I
Well,
want to zoom. Go ahead.
oh, sorry. Can I just add one thing, Justin?
Go
Because,
for it.
like,
Yeah.
like you were just describing, I think a challenge that anyone who's listening to this is going to be familiar with, right? Like, you
Mhm.
do your thing, like you did the thing that you're contracted to do, or whatever. You've got your outputs.
Mhm.
You've got your thing that you hand off, and even if it's like a fantastic kind of intervention, you're handing it off to like folks who are going to be implementing, iterating on it, like as the background conditions change, the thing, that beautiful, thing that you've designed will be less or more well fitting to new circumstances, right? Like, so
Yep.
focusing on like, you can think about like success at the level of outputs, right?
Mhm.
Like, oh, well, we did this strategy, or we did this branding document, or we did this like interface redesign, or whatever it is, right? Like, that's at the level of output.
Yeah.
And I would say that at the level of outcome, like, oh, what's it doing for the stakeholders? But like, how, like, can the people that you've handed it off to like run with it and continue
Mhm.
to do that going forward? I think that's another like outcome level to be distinguished from the output, of the
Yeah,
design.
yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So
100.
anyway, I'm sorry. I just wanted to like, but I think that your point there, that like you do this handoff and you're like, oh, I hope. And so like getting to that, like, how are they going to use it? Like,
Yeah.
is this too precious to touch, or can someone like reconfigure and do more of it on their own?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I've been there. And so I was just curious how it works for such a big brand and idea and like think tank that you guys have, because it's like you guys are working on stuff that isn't just normally like a design breakdown for a logo.
Mhm.
You're
Yeah.
implementing strategies and ideas, and it's just like, I don't, it's like that you kind of run into that place where you don't get to see the finished product, quote
Mhm.
unquote. Like the handoff is the finish, but you don't get to see it 5 years, 10 years, later because it's kind of like it kind of time flies and life happens. So I was just
Yeah.
curious how it works for you too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, on that example, right? This is not necessarily a specific Foossa project, but in the design discourse, every few years, it seems there's going to be like something, some big corporation does a whole rebranding, and then
Yeah.
it's revealed that like whatever agency did it, like charged like $5 million, and that's not
Yeah.
even to like change the signs on the buildings or on the packaging. It's
Nope.
really just that, and like I think folks who are unfamiliar with this kind of work are like, what did they pay for, right? It's certainly not $5 million of photoshopping, right? That's probably
Mhm.
it's sort of thinking about like an iceberg. That's just a
Yep.
tiny percentage of that, but it's just like all of the meetings. Can you imagine like getting all of these senior executives on board on the same page to feel
Yep.
comfortable with this idea? And so it's like they've paid for that white glove service, right?
Yeah.
Of like the hand holding, the education about what branding even is, like all
Mhm.
of that stuff that we don't see. And it's like,
Oh
okay,
yeah.
yeah, like, they changed some vectors for the final thing, like whatever,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
No, but I agree with you because it's like it's not like for me, I've worked with where I had to get clearance from 3 to 4 people. Like when you guys are working on this larger scale, it's like maybe 10, maybe 15, maybe it needs to be everybody in the room. And it's just like, so it's just like that push and pull of like, okay, yeah, let me ask you this. How do you know when a project is finished? Like without them signing off on it, but you two are looking at it and you're saying, David, I think we're good. Lee, I think we're in that sweet spot. How do you both know when it's finished? Even then, when you get a client that is very much, can you tweak this? Or what about this? But how do you get them off of that to look at the big picture? We've all have encountered that where it's like, we're done. We've done everything you asked us. Wait, you want us to change the text? Are you crazy right now? So it's like, how do you guys know when it's done and communicating that to a client?
Since you're better at this than I am, LS, I cede the floor.
This is a tough one. Scope creep happens to the best of us. Unfortunately, I think part of it is like, how do you structure your contracts so that, it's like, okay, yes, we can change that, but we're billing by the hour now.
Yeah.
Like, just as like protecting
Yeah.
time. But I think like with some of these, if the big picture kind of conceptual stuff is done, I think with Fusa, we've really mostly focused on some of the strategy that's like the prerequisite for implementation that often happens with implementation partners, just because it's not, it's not a good use of most of our clients' money to be paying us for implementation
Mhm.
in that sense of like changing the copy on their website. But if like the concept of the brand is done, I think that's where we feel comfortable enough with like the handoff or having these sort of more protective contractual clauses. But it is a lot of work to get to
Yeah.
like the insights that get to that strategy. I think that's the best way I can answer that without getting into like specifics.
No, I totally get it. I just curious because bigger company, you guys deal with bigger brands, and I know they always have the 1 or 2 people that always want to input something, and then it flips everybody's brain. They're like, I didn't think of that. What about this? And it's like, all right, if y'all willing to pay for it, we can do whatever you want.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay, but let's zoom in for a moment. Like speaking about the company and the campaigns you guys have done, I'm kind of interested into knowing like the individual now. So how has your personal or cultural background shaped your values around storytelling, equity, and participation? Because those seem to be like the 3 key words that I'm hearing a lot from our conversation and through my research and through your website and what you've put out. So how has it personally and culturally affected both of you?
I think I can start
Okay.
if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, for example, a lot of my formal training as a designer was at NYU. I did a master's at the Interactive Telecommunications program at NYU Tisch, which was this kind of started out actually in the 70s as this interdisciplinary program that really the ethos was like people from different backgrounds working together. It was very much like Montessori school for adults with
Yeah.
technology who wanted to do artsy things. And so that's shaped like how I teach, but also how I approach a lot of creative projects of like
Mhm.
just being very open
Mhm.
to folks with different forms of expertise,
Mhm.
but also like a kind of non-attachment to a process. I think it's different maybe from folks who come from much stricter kinds of like creative training. For example, where it's more like, okay, you want to be like your professors, or you want to like
Yeah.
do that sort of thing. And then I think another big part of what's like molded me the way that like I facilitate, but also the way that I conduct research is just my cross-cultural background. So I'm first generation American. I was born in Taiwan, but I've also had the chance to like I studied in Europe, I worked in Brazil, I worked in Japan. So just this idea that like, a lot of these cultural conceptions of like what is good design, what is good taste, really vary, right? And there's things that I learned in Brazil where it's like trying to conduct a workshop with multiple stakeholders, and like the American in me is just like, okay, let's get down to business and let's keep on, let's look at the time and all of this. Whereas in Brazil, it was just like, somebody actually turned to me in this workshop that was kind of what we thought was going off the rails. She was like bicultural, she'd studied in America but grew up in Brazil. Was like, yeah, people have to feel comfortable first before they can do business stuff. So it's like, okay, so everyone has to like introduce themselves for like 10 minutes and talk about their kids and their hometowns. And, it's just a different kind of cultural context. So I think like that, yeah, openness to cross-cultural, cross-disciplinary collaboration, and then also just being able to improvise. Like I actually do improv now, and like improvise as a musician. It's like I'm more about playing jazz than classical in that sense of like just being able to go with it depending on the moment. I think has been shaped my particular point of view as a designer.
David, what about you? What do you think?
I think, oh gosh, I think Scott Page is a professor maybe at Michigan, but he has this phrase like the many model thinker or the multi-model thinker. And I think like, Ellis, you were just gesturing toward this, but like, yeah, like I think it's important to be able to move between different like sensing or analytical modes and different producing kind of modes as well, right? Just on like a personal background note, right? Like I studied cognitive science and psychology as an undergrad, and my first master's program was in public administration and econometrics and doing that kind of analysis, brain stuff, and there's like like policy and economic stuff. These days, I'm a system scientist, and I work in a lab with a bunch of aerospace engineers, and we do stuff like satellite design, or like like systems so that satellites don't crash into each other, or using Earth observation for a variety of projects on Earth for like disaster preparedness or tracking invasive species or whatever it is, right? Like, and learning to talk to a bunch of aerospace engineers about stuff versus life scientists versus policy analysts versus whatever, like a lot of like critical theory and like and folks who are like more engaged in social problems and social definition, right? Like being able to hold multiple models and realize like this problem space or this situation looks one way through this frame. Can I apply a different frame? And knowing that there are multiple frames out there, I think is super important, right? Like that some are more appropriate than others in certain circumstances. I don't mean to suggest that, oh, everything's all relative, but like sometimes you've got a hammer and you need to hammer the nail. Sometimes you have a hammer and you need to like start the motor, and it's like, oh, that that tool isn't very useful there, right? Like so the tool's usefulness varied depending on circumstance. And I think that like outlook and mental models function similarly. And so I guess I've like tried to cultivate personally like just like some subject matter expertise in a variety of fields in order to kind of like grok, oh, how does a psychologist think about this? Like actually just for fun at MIT, I took this class on like the resilience of living systems to perturbation. So like look from a plant biologist, and so it's
Wait, hold on real quick. What was that? What was the title? When you said it, my brain said, what was the title?
I don't remember the exact title of the class, but it had something to do with the perturbation, like, and how living resilience in the face of perturbation or something. Like perturbation being like a change in like the state. So say that like you're I don't know, a plant, and like the wind blows really hard one day, or it's like it's really like there's a drought or something. How do living systems respond to those kinds of external changes that like, hey, we're all working and saving, hopefully in retirement accounts, and we hope that when we're retired, we'll be able to access them. But like, what if there's a financial crash or the dollar collapses in value or whatever else, right? How do you become resilient in the face of some of these external changes? Not that I have all the answers to that, but but I think like it's just
So it
useful.
sounds like
Like,
finding the right question is also a big part of it.
yeah, and one of the things you say often, Lishan, is like creative cross training, right? Like that. Like you have to be able to like and I think it's important, like for professional development purposes, to kind of like seek out opportunities where you get to like think like a biologist about this, or think like a UX designer about this, or think like a novelist about that, right? And like what do you attend to when you're thinking in these different models? And I think like in order to do well, maybe to rephrase, the design projects and experiences that I am most proud of have often involved being able to move between different models for understanding what the problem is and how to intervene in it. And in order to do that, I have tried to cultivate, like a variety of professional perspectives. Then there are the personal ones too, right? Like there aren't a whole lot of like, Black men in design in my experience, and so like I think that, like that's I'm differently situated in a lot of these rooms where I am, or in a lot of these projects. Like intercultural teams are important, right? Like diversity, again, to go back to the like the diversity of mental models, the diversity of backgrounds, whatever, like it helps you see more and better. So cultivating opportunities to like improve the diversity of your own tools, I think is important.
No. So I'm curious now, what was the moment for each of you that made you say, you know what, design is what I want to do? What was that moment for you?
I feel like, well, this is true. Like I didn't call myself a designer until we started our design practice. The first time I was in a classroom where design was being taught, I was the teacher at Parsons, right? Like, and so
Wow.
in a narrow sense. In a broader sense, actually, Lishan was riffing on the RuPaul quote earlier, right? Like, we were born naked and the rest is design. Everything is design. Human systems are designed. Artifacts are designed, right? And we have some expertise as users, just as people who are living in these systems, right? And I think it's helpful to take that kind of perspective on whatever training and background that we have. Like, well, when economists are trying to, or policy folks are trying to think about like how a program works to incentivize investment or particular behaviors or public health, vaccination campaigns, like people are assuming the role of behavioral design, right? And might not have training in that, as such, right? But we are all I think of design as like an ecumenical and broad enough discipline to hold all of that, right? And so we're all doing design. I think by calling myself or becoming a designer through being one, I have learned more methods and like expanded that toolkit for like ways of doing this design work better than I had before, for sure. But like I would say that it's really owing to Lishan that I got into the field of design as such, because I think otherwise I might have stayed with other like more constrained methods,
Yeah, like I had been doing design since I was a kid, right? Whether it was like building forts in the backyard to like I remember like my parents owned a computer store when I was growing up in Arizona, and like I like would like intern there and stuff. And I remember like drawing like a blueprint for like how to like set up these racks of servers in the store. So there was like stuff like that that I'd been doing since I was a child, and I'd done other creative things. But I think it really was like in grad school and like kind of ending up in my first like design job, or it's like, okay, I'm a creative person, I'm an artist, I am interested in different kinds of like crafts and performance and whatever, but designer seemed like a professional identity where like people would take you seriously and like pay you money and like stuff like that. But also like it was a lens at looking at, power and participation and democracy through other methods, right? That was more expansive than like my undergrad degree in politics in the narrower sense. So it just seemed to fit in that sense.
So now I'm curious. This is going to be kind of a light, fun one.
Okay.
What helps you guys recharge creatively? Because it's like you I feel like for David, just listening, a lot of thinking going on. So how do you disconnect and allow yourself to just relax? So are there any like routines, guilty pleasures, any go-to books? Like what helps you just take a break and then you can plug back into it? Because I feel like many people or many creatives and designers run into that burnout. So how do you avoid that burnout?
I mean, like one answer is like retreating to video games for a while. Another is like just immersion in something else, right? Like that's just very different. And like I guess that recharges the capacity to see things differently. Like just this, I guess maybe last week or over the weekend, feeling a little burnt out, and I picked up a collection of short stories by this sci-fi writer, novelist, essayist, I don't, but just like a Ted Chiang's Exhalation. I can't recommend this enough, but like it's an awesome like collection of short stories, but just being able to like see through someone else's eyes for a while and understand like that's a kind of recharge for me that I find really meaningful. Like other people, I don't know, exercise, I could probably do with more of that, and other kinds of restorative hobbies.
Yeah.
But I think that opportunity to really just like experience the like someone else's story world, someone else's point of view, like in a really meaningful way. I find that really recharging.
Lee, what about you?
I think like since moving to Rhode Island, it's really like one way it like took us out of just like the constant hustle and grind of New York City. So I started gardening because we actually have space for that. And I think,
Nice.
obviously there's design involved in terms of like, okay, where do you plant, but where, and like stuff you can do, like water your plants, but a lot of it is just out of your control, right? It's like, okay, it's sun and it's rain and it's the plant doing its thing. And then there's just something kind of really grounding, very rooted literally in stuff like that. It was like, okay, it's strawberry season here. So we've just been eating like strawberries from the garden. It's like the ultimate kind of like locavore kind of thing, right? So like that just very magical in that sense, because so much of our work is like it's on Zoom or we're recording this podcast remotely, right? And it's just like
screen
even
time.
though it is social, but it is screen time,
Yeah.
And then the other great thing about living here is just being having time to do like very much non-commercial artistic things. I sing in a choir, I do improv and stuff like that. And so there's like a great like community arts scene here.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. Thank you guys for sharing that. So I kind of want to put in this fun quick fire round that I always do just to keep you guys on your toes. So the first thing that comes to mind, don't overthink it. So one workshop tool or method you can swear by.
One workshop tool or method.
Okay, I have two quick thoughts if you're thinking, Lishan. One is like one that I got from you, like as an icebreaker activity, tell the story of something in your wallet or your bag in a workshop, like, or the story of your name. I think both of those like kind of activate participants' innate capacity as storytellers, and you learn about each other in a really fun way. What tool that we've used is like a future casting canvas where we imagine different elements of like telling us possibility stories about the future to organize work. I think like that's been really helpful too.
And then I'll second those, but also add like some sort of soft thing to pass around, like either like a stuffy or like, I mean, this like stuffed bacteria thing, or like something just to like, okay, because it brings people back to like elementary school, and it's just like, okay, if you have the thing. And then also, I have a cowbell that was given as a gift when we did some workshops at West Point. And I guess it's a replica of the one they used to like call the cadets for mealtime or something. And it's just a great way to get attention, when you have a large group you're facilitating.
Okay. Most underrated design book or thinker. I'll throw that in there. Most underrated design book or thinker.
Underrated.
Yeah.
I've got an idea, but I don't know if it's underrated exactly. But all right. Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He's a historian of science and a physicist by training, but wrote this book introducing and popularizing the phrase paradigm shift, so maybe that's something you're familiar with from, but he tells this story about like normal science and how normal science proceeds. It's like, oh, okay, well, hey, we've got like a a geocentric model of our solar system. So like, the Earth is the center and the sun and all the other planets revolve around it. And we can do all of these things and tell all these stories about this, but eventually enough like observation and measurement begins accumulating that doesn't fit into this model. And so then, we need a Copernican revolution where we have a heliocentric model, like, oh, well, actually the sun is the center and the Earth revolves around it. Like that like there are theories that are explanatory to a point, but over time there's all this other stuff that builds up outside of it, right? At that point, you need to make a transition in what your overarching narrative or theory or story is, and so I think that is directly applicable to a lot of design projects, but a lot of designers probably don't come across a historian of science writing about scientific revolutions, so maybe underrated in that respect, but really useful.
Okay. Lishan, what about
I'm
you?
really having trouble with this because there's so many, like, not overrated, but like people who are worthy of their rating.
Okay, I'll make it easier for you. If you could collaborate with this one person, who would it be?
You know what? I do have an answer now.
Okay.
For design, like obviously not underrated in life or career, but I would say Julia Child. I've been watching like this YouTuber try to like make her recipes, and like obviously she was writing in a different time when people just had more time to cook and stuff, but like if you think about the time period too, she was introducing French cooking to Americans, most of whom had never experienced it before. And so just from a design perspective of how do you write a recipe of like something, and this is even before her TV show, right? And so like thinking about that, like, and travel wasn't that prominent then either. So it's like, how do you transmit this entire culinary culture and try to document it in some way for a different cultural context? I think is fascinating to think about that in terms of design.
Okay. Coffee shop playlist. What is your go-to coffee shop playlist? Is it lo-fi, jazz, hip-hop, electronic, or just straight silence?
Yeah, I like lo-fi, and instrumental bossa nova is also a go-to for me.
David, what about you?
Yeah, I would say like lo-fi of several varieties. Also, embarrassingly, but truly, like video game music for like, like, because you're playing for hours and like this has to be able to be like moving, but also background, that ends up in my playlist all.
Okay. All right. 2 more. Coffee, tea, or matcha?
I like all of the above. I'll say matcha because it's on the list. I like the actual traditional ceremony of it all, and also the little Japanese sweets that you have with your matcha.
Yeah, I would say all of the above as well.
Okay. Last one. Design for participation. Describe it in 1 sentence.
Democratizing creativity.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I don't know if I can go.
Dropping the mic, the mic is on a stand.
He's just like, David is like, ditto.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty apt distillation, actually.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about guidance for our next generation. I mean, you guys are both teachers. Many of them listen to this podcast. What is some of the best advice for someone starting out who wants to build a practice that it's value driven? Forgive me.
I mean, this might sound elementary, but like, what are the values that you are foregrounding? And, because there are going to be tensions between them. We were just talking about like democratizing our participation and expertise, like there's a tension sometimes between democratic participation and technical expertise, for example, right? How are you going to hold those values when they're in tension with each other? Being clear on what some of the values are and how they might come into tension with one another is really important. Another just piece of advice, I suppose, that is, a little different from some of the direction of that prompt, or at least the initial half of that answer, is like be good with your contract design. We think about, I think a lot of designers are drawn to the work, and to your question, it's like we want to do the work because we want to see the work in the world, right? But that work can only be sustained if it's a sustainable business model. If like you're like, you can't like let your passion like make up whatever differential is necessary every single time, right? Like there need to be contracts that pay you on a timely basis and enough to like live on comfortably. Like, and so, like being attentive to that and some of these like business structure things.
And I think
It's
framing
not,
that as a design project helps sort of defang
yeah,
some of the like, oh my
yeah.
God, business, you know?
But it's not the sort of thing that most designers get into this to do, right?
Hmm.
But like
Mhm.
in order to
Right.
do that work, it's absolutely key. And so there are a bunch of good references on how to start up like a business. And so I don't think we need to go into those. But peruse some of those things, I would say,
Hmm.
to like aspiring designers.
Lee, what about you?
I feel like I diagnose a couple issues that I see, not just with younger designers, but designers in general. One is like a kind of sameness because everyone's just looking at the same references and
Mm,
inspiration and copying from
Yeah.
each other.
Yep.
And then there's also just unfortunately this like almost like starchitect kind of problem with other forms of design as well, of like the very small number of celebrity designers, that's like an aspirational thing, but it's like
Mhm.
thinking about like how do you, instead of like chasing the trends and like the stuff that everybody copies each other
Mhm.
from, is like cultivate your creative community, like rather than like
Yeah.
networking as advice, which I think is like just stupid or not, it's not like
Mhm.
specific enough. Is like, what is your scene, right? Like I came up just hanging out with groups of friends. We were, we had a very punk aesthetic, and we would
Mhm.
make like, terrible indie movies and like weird music and stuff like that. And like some of us I've still kept in touch as adults and stuff like that. Or like, I'm starting to do that here in Rhode Island now that we've lived here for a few years now, and just like cultivate that instead,
Mhm.
and be influenced that way rather than like, the same online influencers are trying to be the star. And then also think about like, especially with community centered design and stuff like that, is like think about how to cultivate being a facilitator.
Yeah.
And you could learn that in different ways, but think about like, I don't know, work a unionized job and get involved in
Mhm.
your union, or do like community organizing, like stuff like that.
Mhm.
I think builds a lot of the necessary skills for that.
What's one mindset shift that helped you early on that you still carry with you today?
I think that like good taste is like relative,
mm,
based on like culture. And also
Mhm.
it's like what works as design isn't necessarily like
Mhm.
what wins design awards, and like wins the approval of your peers.
So, I have a curious question for you both. What is your take on AI and the use of it in design? And do you see AI coming for companies like you guys where it's like people are feeling like, hey, we don't have the budget, we can't. They're basically almost removing the human touch. So, how do you feel about it? And what's your headspace on
I think some of the people and organizations I've seen using it weren't going to pay for a designer anyway.
it?
Either they didn't have the budget for it, or it just like wasn't on their radar. I into like making weird stuff with like the image generating
Yeah.
AIs, right? It's like stuff that you cannot get as a stock image, or like, even like try to make yourself. And then I've found it, like the large language models, helpful in terms of like concept development and ideation, and like more as like a thought partner for like copywriting. But like, yeah, don't be lazy with it and like just put in the, copy and paste it. It's more about like the dialogue with the AI when it comes to the text-based stuff for me.
Yeah. David, what do you think?
yeah, I, I don't know how
Mhm.
like the diffusion of more large models is going to influence all of our work, right?
Mhm.
Like I guess I've worked on like AI governance and ethics issues for several years, through Foossa projects, where like I guess starting as early as like 2014. I've done like other AI stuff, right? Like one of the things that just I don't think I've quite put this into words well yet, but like it's this idea that that AI, or as we're often referring to AI, like large models, right? Like are kind of like social technology that structure the way that we see,
Mhm.
and they structure the ways that we experience things. I mean, like just search is transitioning from like clicking on this blue link to like getting an AI summary of something that came from like sources unknown, right? Or
Uh-huh.
like that. So other folks work on like AI, like bias or provenance or watermarking, or these other sorts of things. But like I think that when we start to I don't know, like social media has conditioned us to think about moments and communication differently, right? Like
Mhm.
take photos of our food at restaurants and like like post vacation photos with an eye toward like, oh, well, what will this communicate about me? And we experience other people's lives and stories as mediated through something that's going to be curated algorithmically. And so like we know all of that, but like it still
Right. Or it
changes.
creates the sameness, that we were talking
Well,
about.
to some of the point that you were making a couple minutes ago, right? Like that there's a potentially homogenizing effect to that because like it's like, oh, well, we know the sorts of things that are going to get traction. So we subtly start positioning, like, oh, well, conflict is good, or like getting some, like,
Yeah.
if there's disagreement in this Reddit thread, that's going to really boost the engagement or whatever, right? Like, I think AI will do something similar to our sensibilities and our ways of seeing and our ways of valuing things. I don't know how to characterize what I think those changes are, at least not like concisely.
Yeah.
But I think that like paying attention to like how we are changing, what we see, what we notice, and how we express ourselves will be important. And I think that that will have ramifications for the ways that we work and the kinds of business that we undertake too.
So let's look forward for a moment. I mean, the world of design and creativity is changing fast. Like they're already on to the next trends for the next 5 years already. So, how do you see the role of design evolving for you and Fusa? How do you see design evolving in the next 5 years for your company?
I see it like since we were just talking about AI, is like focusing on those things that like cannot be replaced, by a large language model or generative AI or whatever that might be. So it's like a lot of it, I think, will also require like client education, kind of more of a cultural education about like what is the role, right? Or like I gave the example of like the $2 million, $5 million branding
Yeah.
projects. It's like it's really like that journey of alignment and facilitation and like strategy, all of that sort of stuff, right? Like the implementation side will change just as like, computers and Photoshop changed, what was analog design in the past, right? So that stuff I think is much more volatile, but you're still going to have human clients on the other end, right? And how do
Yeah.
you deal with them, not just as individuals, but as a group? And how do you distill the creativity of that group and the expertise of that group and translate it into something concrete? Like that layer, I think, is something that I'd like to be focusing on.
Yeah. And I guess, I want to kind of like recommit to and like deepen like my practice of like looking at the design of systems and how learning and feedback happens within these systems, because I think you need to design different like listening mechanisms. We see like examples of this where like a product is launched and it like tanks, and it's because the like feedback on the design, frictions or what have you, like weren't recorded, like that feedback wasn't recorded well, or it didn't reach the right people, or there wasn't
Right.
like a means of learning, right? And this happens in a variety of systems. And so I want to spend more time thinking about how we design, like these kinds of social technologies with that serve that kind of listening feedback cybernetic learning function within any system that we're talking about.
Yes. Now, let me ask you this. You might have to think about this one, but let's say in the future, if you could design or work with any institution or community without any limits, who would it be?
No limits?
No limits. You could co-design or you can design for them, any institution or community with no limits. Who would it be?
Well, I'll just say I'm doing a couple of projects with NASA now through like like translating some like science insights into like products that can be used for a variety of other purposes, right? Like there are so many talented like people within any kind of organization really where there's like that kind of expertise, and I guess I'm thinking about the federal government because so many of these things are being cut and so many people are being lost and their knowledge is being lost. But like, in a blue sky kind of scenario, I would love to work with like the NIH or NASA on a like, here's the next 50 years, how we're thinking about that. What is our role in this? How are we like cultivating the next generation of researchers, and how are we defining the problems that are important for us as a society, right? And I think like a lot of that ends up like looking like sustainability work too. And so I just think that there are many potentially interesting things there, but we need a pretty wide remit to
Yeah.
do it. So
Yeah, with the no
blue sky,
limits thing, I would say the US government as well, but like having not like a limited definition of scope for design, but really thinking about like the policy side of things as well. And that really brings together the two parts of my academic background and experience.
Yeah. All right, you guys. Well, David, Lishan, we are rolling. We are cooking. I just have a few more questions before we finish this podcast. You guys, this has just been so fruitful, and it's just dope to get a cool insight to a dynamic team like you two. So my hat's off to you guys. You guys are dope. Like, this is crazy to hear, like, how you both kind of, it's almost like you guys live in each other's brain, quote unquote, because you live with each other. But it's just beautiful to see how you guys break down this whole dynamic for like your company, for your thoughts and what your future goals are. And I think that's dope. So last question to bring it home. What's one thing you hope listeners walk away with thinking, feeling, or hearing after this conversation?
That design is ultimately about power. It's about aesthetics, it's about craft, but ultimately it is about how you shape power. And so that comes with great responsibility, like Spider-Man.
David, what do you think?
Something along those lines, really, that, like more of our systems and our world is amenable to design and redesign than we sometimes think. And that we all have something to contribute to that, that like, our own perspectives are useful for understanding the scope of potential redesign of things that we all interact with and care about, So I'd say that like we are all designers, everything is design, and consequently, we all have some responsibility to be careful designers and the opportunity to design too.
So say we all.
Yes. Lishan, David, thank you both. This has been such a rich and layered conversation. My name is Justin Robinson. I have these just awesome dynamic duo of thinker and designer and creative, Lishan and David, and this is the Art School Graduate Podcast. We'll catch you guys later. Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.